India's debt is rising. Yes, you heard it correct. India's debt has been increasing in the last many years.
India's household debt likely surged to a record high.
A new report says Indians are borrowing more than ever, which is strange for our society because most Indians see debt as a bad thing. They prefer savings and solidity. So why are they taking loans now?
India's debt to GDP ratio is at a very high rate of 57%. And a recently released report of Financial Stability Report by the RBI suggests that the household debt in relation to GDP in our country has increased considerably and at a very alarming high rates in the last 3 to 4 years. In June of 2021, India's household debt to GDP ratio was around 36.6% and it has increased to 42.9% of its GDP by June 2024. So in the span of 3 years, we can see an alarming increase in the debt to GDP ratio, especially household debt to GDP ratio of our country. Now, while still we can say that India's household debt to GDP ratio compared to the global standards, it's still relatively okay. But the debt to GDP ratio, the overall debt to GDP ratio, which is at 57%, is alarmingly very, very high. Now, this recently released report, the Financial Stability Report of the RBI, has again called to attention the question of household finances and consumption in our economy, and where these finances are being utilized by the household in our economy. Because recently, if we see, RBI has taken a lot of different steps to enhance credit and boost credit creation in the economy, especially for the household sector. First, as you all remember, is the reduction of CRR. That is CRR reduction from 4.5% to 4%. Reduction cash reserve ratio, we call it. And the second was reduction in repo rates in our country, which is from 6.5% to 6.25%. Both of these measures typically shows that RBI is wanting to enhance credit in the society and enhance especially credit for the household sector, because household consumption marks more than 50 to 60% of the total GDP of our country. But there is one question which needs to be asked, that is household taking unsustainable levels of debt or not? And is that level of debt which the households are taking in our country, is it sustainable in long run, or is it going to be making our household sector under debt, under bad debts, which is ultimately leading to non-performing asset crisis? All these questions we'll be trying to answer in this particular session. Hello, my name is Preetpal Singh and you are watching Perspective. Now, debt simply means a loan which is typically taken by a household to acquire any asset, whether it be home, whether it be vehicle, or usually for personal consumption reasons as well, maybe for a marriage, maybe for any of the functions. Also, all the data indicate that households in our country are borrowing recently more for consumption rather than asset creation. Typically, a loan or a debt is taken by a household for asset creation. But the latest data in the Financial Stability Report published by the RBI suggests that recently, in the last 10 years, households have been taking more consumption-oriented loans as compared to asset creation loans. Now, which makes us ask one question, that is the conspicuous consumption culture in India, has it risen to an extent that people are now taking loans to meet their consumption requirements? That is the question which we need to answer. And this scenario simply shows a shift in the borrowing trends in our country. That means earlier, while people were borrowing for asset creation more, now people are borrowing for consumption-oriented needs. For example, buying an iPhone, this is consumption. People are taking loans. Households is taking loan for it. While buying, let's say, appliances, TV, fridge, or buying any of these small things, which are consumption-oriented, consumption-driven things or goods or services for the people, for the household. Taking loans with respect to this has seen an uprise in the recent years, rather than taking a loan for a property, which has also seen an increase, but not to an extent of increase in consumption-oriented loans. Also, the RBI report, it is kind of giving mixed signals, and it's giving a mixed picture regarding the consumer credit which is being taken by the people. One thing which it suggests is that a significant portion of the household debt or the loans have been taken by healthy prime borrowers, reducing the share of subprime borrowing in the country, which is again a healthy part, which is again a good sign for the economy. Also, the rising per capita income, that is one major reason which is observed among the subprime borrowers who are taking loans, and they are using those loans for creating certain assets and also reducing discretionary spending on the loan. So creation of asset is more rather than the discretionary spending. But however, one contrasting thing which I discussed earlier as well was that borrowing in relation to consumption oriented expenses has increased, particularly amongst lower income groups of the country. That is what needs to be noted, that amongst lower income groups, LIGs, consumption oriented borrowings and loans have increased. See, while some would say that these trends are showcasing a mature credit market, but let me say this also questions the sustainability of household credit and sustainability of household finances as well. This puts the sustainability into question. Now, if you see, we have been using two terms in relation to borrowers. One is prime borrower, one is subprime borrower. Now, prime borrower is a borrower who's taking loan and is having high credit worthiness. That means the risk of not being able to repay the loan is very low. So these are low risk borrowers, which means their ability to repay the loan is much higher than others because of their sound financial background, because of high credit worthiness, and because of numerous other reasons as well. That is prime borrowers. Now there is subprime borrowers, which means they are high risk borrowers, which means their credit worthiness is low, their credit score is low, and their ability to repay the loan back, the risk in it is really high. So there is one particular data in the report that 64% of the loans taken by the subprime borrowers is for asset creation in the economy. That is one data which is important. And one more data which is important is that nearly half of the loan taken by these subprime borrowers is used for consumption. That is, are being used for consumption rather than investments. And also one more data which is very startling is that the majority of lower income group households, that means households with income less than 5 lakh rupees per annum, they're heavily relying on one type of credit, that is unsecured credit. That is credit through credit cards or personal loans, usually using it for daily expenses. So heavy reliance of low income household on these unsecured credits is again a thing of concern for the household debt overall scenario in our country. And this trend suggests a very worrisome situation, that most of the households in the country, they are borrowing but not for creation of wealth, because ideally borrowing is usually done for investment purposes, for wealth creation purposes, especially for high income people, high net worth individuals. But for these people, lower income groups, for them, they are taking credit, they are taking loans, they are taking debt in order to meet their day-to-day expenses. This is the most startling fact, and this is the most worrisome fact which we can see as a part of the report. Also, high delinquency rate, which means high rate of not being able to repay back the loan under credit card and personal loans for these low-income people groups, shows one particular thing, which is financial stress amongst these groups, which is again a worrisome situation. And in such a situation, definitely the household debt, which is massive in our country and which has increased in the last 3 to 4 years as well considerably, this delinquency rate, which means the default rate, it shows the credit situation and the household debt to GDP ratio in a very, very bad light, because sustainability of debt is in question now. Now, one logical question here to discuss is that what is the relation of this debt taken by the households and for the overall economy as well? What is the relationship of debt with economic growth? Now, the relation is not very simple but intricate. Now, household, when they take debt, for them, income multiplier is very huge. That means if their income increases, if their disposable money increases, they usually spend more on goods and services, because that is what they are actually aspiring for. That is to get a better good, get a better service, all those things. So, which means multiplier effect for the households, small income household, middle income households and lower income households, for them, debt plays a very important role in boosting the GDP. Because while they take the debt, they go for consumption, and consumption forms a part of the GDP. If you know, expenditure method of the GDP suggests that there are 4 components of the GDP. One is consumption, which is done by the households. One is investments, which is done by the producers. Third is the government expenditure, which is done by the government. And fourth is net exports, that is exports minus imports, which is done by the external sector. So all these 4 components combined, that is your consumption, investments, government expenditure and net exports, they form a part of expenditure method. Now, under this expenditure method, all these 4 things combined becomes your GDP. And amongst all these 4 components, consumption is the heaviest component of all. And increase in household debt clearly increases this consumption component of the GDP, which means that the GDP is also going to rise if there is increase in household debt of the country. So household debt increases, GDP increases, economic growth prospers. This can also lead to development, but it is not very directly correlated. But yes, economic growth is one of the prerequisite to economic development of the country as well. Because multiple times you have observed that this household loan is either taken for healthcare also, it's taken for the education purposes as well, it's taken for the human resource development, for skilling, for any courses. All those things also are involved in this household debt, which also ensures that this household debt, rather alongside increasing the consumption, also increases the human capital, which in long run increases the investment and also net exports of the country, which means the multiplier effect of this increase in debt in relation to the GDP is much higher. But one thing which we have already discussed and touched upon, inability of the borrowers to repay back the loan which they have taken. Now in such a scenario, it reduces their disposable income. It puts a direct hit. It gives a direct hit to their disposable income, reducing the overall consumption of theirs and also reducing the overall economic growth. So ability to repay, that must be created amongst the households in our country. Again, that can be created through education, through empowerment, through skill development, through employment opportunities and through different other avenues. So that whatever the credit or the loans are taken by the middle income or lower income households can be repaid back in time. Because that would ensure that debt is used for good productive purposes, and alongside that the banking system of the country also remains safe, secure and sound. And in response to this, as already told to you, RBI has taken certain measures. Now, alongside this, RBI has taken certain prudential measures as well. Alongside change in repo and CRR, prudential measures include a strict monitoring of the financial institutions. That are they giving loans recklessly, or are they following proper criteria while giving loans? Basically to prevent reckless lending practices. And alongside that, banks are being encouraged to lend more to prime borrowers rather than subprime borrowers, because from subprime you can get one more crisis which happened in the world. You can relate it to that 2008 global financial crisis, or it's also known as subprime mortgage crisis, where housing loans were given to subprime borrowers. That means the borrowers who did not even have the capacity to repay. The credit worthiness was low. So in this case, RBI is promoting and inducing and motivating the banks, the commercial banks of the country, to give more loans to prime borrowers whose credit worthiness is good and their ability to repay back the loan is also good. Now, as we all know, that this increased reliance of loans or household debt on more of consumption expenses, day-to-day expenses, rather than the asset creation is a situation of worry for India. But still, RBI, the commercial banks, as well as the government needs to take certain measures in order to ensure that household debt for the households, for the individuals like all of us, it's easy to get. And they don't have to rely on informal sources of credit. Because still, if you see in agriculture, around 35 to 40% of farmers are still dependent on informal sources of credit. And this number is even huge if we see from the perspective of the whole country, if we see from the perspective of just household. So which means measures should be taken by all the stakeholders in order to ensure, first of all, formalization of credit. Second, adequate benefits to the households, including moratoriums, restructuring, waivers, subsidies. All these things needs to be looked upon for those households who actually need it the maximum. So eventually, if we are considerate towards the households and if we see that the debt levels in the country are controlled and the rising consumer debt, which is rising day by day in our country, if that is controlled and that is put forward for a better use than what it is currently being used, then eventually we'll be able to ensure that this debt taken by the household fuels the GDP, which eventually fuels the economic growth and which eventually helps us in meeting the 2047 Developed India target, that is Viksit Bharat by the year 2047. I hope you gained a new perspective from this session about the consumer debt and about the household debt in our country. Please let me know what are your views surrounding household debt and how do we solve this problem and make it efficient and better for the households to use. Let me know in the comment section. All the very best. Have a beautiful day. Thank you.